I have 3 Be a Better Writer tips. The first, write. The second, read. The third, get together with other writers. That third one can be tricky, but we've got you covered. At the Writing Excuses Retreats, we offer classes, one-on-one sessions, and assorted activities to inspire, motivate, and recharge writers just like you. As you make meaningful progress on your stories, you'll build connections with your fellow writers that will last for years to come. Check out our upcoming events at writingexcuses.com/retreats.
This episode of Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. If you would like to learn how to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/writingexcuses. Season 19, Episode 45. This is Writing Excuses.
A close reading on structure, tying it all together.
15 minutes long because you're in a hurry.
And we're not that smart.
I'm Mary Robinette.
I'm Dong Wan.
I'm Erin.
And I'm Howard.
This has been such a fun conversation. I have been enjoying this all through this series of getting ready to, really digging in. When you're thinking about these conversations, what's one of the big pieces that you took away that you're like, oh, I'm going to think about that a lot more now when I'm approaching my own work?
For me, the big one was POV as structure. Because in 5th season, you have the usual scene switching of POV. I say usual. It's pretty common. You switch POV when you switch chapters, and that defines a structure. But there's an underlying superstructure there that you weren't expecting, it's part of the big turn. And there's an element of that is hugely thematic. And so I guess that's the big thing I came away with.
Yeah. I think for me, this might be evident from how much I talked last episode, but for me, the thing I think so much about with this book is how it fits in the genre and what it has done to the genre, and the excitement I have for books that are coming out and will be coming out in conversation with this book. Moving away from Restoration Fantasy to a different model is so exciting to me, and I'm really interested to see where that goes and how that continues to develop.
I think I'm going to be thinking a little bit about trying to figure out what the beating heart of my manuscripts are. Ooh. Like, you know what I mean? Is it, in this one, we were saying like, it's the breaking apart of the world. It's the breaking apart of the earth. And you see it resonate so many different times. And I'd love to think about what is that for my work and how can I make it so that when we talked about in one episode, when you see it from all angles, you're still seeing that same central theme and central idea.
Yeah, that one was also very exciting to me. I think the thing for me that I had honestly not thought about before we started talking about it and seeing examples in this book was parallelism. I've talked about symmetry all the time. I think about that. I think about mirroring, but having those parallels and the different ways that things get represented, that I hadn't thought about using as a conscious choice going into something, and I'm very excited about that as a tool to use that I haven't been consciously using.
Yeah, it's really one of my favorites, and it's one we've seen throughout the entire series of close readings. But in this one in particular, I think N.K. Jemisin does something really interesting and really just integrated into each of the storylines, all of the beats of the plots.
Along with the point of view and parallelism, the shift in the using second person and using third person, using both of them, threw me a little bit at first, and then it became a structural signaling device. And the big thing that I took away from it is, hey, Howard, that one project that you've shelved because you can't figure out whether you're allowed to change tenses and change from first to second to third person, the answer is you're allowed to do this. Whether or not I do it well, whether or not any of you ever see it is a completely separate question. But this book gave me permission to try some things that I look forward to failing at.
I think that's a really good point. This book also, when I read it the first time, gave me permission to start thinking about structure in a different way. up to that point, I had very much been thinking 7-point plot structure. That was kind of my go-to. And I knew that I was using a structure that I was using it as a prompt in many ways to help me spot for things. And with this book, I think what Erin was talking about before with that beating heart, that this was the book that made me start thinking, okay, but what if I didn't use someone else's structure? What if I didn't use something that was existing and went into it and made my own thing? So like the novel that I'm working on now, I have scenes that I want to hit, but I'm deliberately not using a 3-act or 7-act structure. I'm setting my brakes where the emotion is pulling it through rather than, and I'm letting that beating heart of the story pull it through. But having said that, one thing that I want to flag for readers is that I don't think N.K. Jemisin could have written this as her first book.
Oh, absolutely not. This is what, her 6th book, 7th book, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, she had 2 full series before this, 100,000 Kingdoms and then The Killing Moon. So like she's deep into her career by this point and was already quite successful as an author, right? And then, I think as we're going through this, a lot of this is, I think, yes, giving permission to break rules, but she's also showing such a mastery of the rule as she does it. She'll set it up and then she'll break it, right? And I think that if you want to break rules, it's something that's really important of communicating, yeah, I know what I'm doing. Watch me do this, though. You know what I mean? It's so much the energy of how you can get away with, quote unquote, breaking the rules. So I want people to read this and feel a permission to try different things, to experiment, to not feel tied to a single tense, a single point of view, a single plot structure, and do some stuff that just feels really wild, that feels different and really stretch and grow. But also remember that you have to be good at the rule first and understand the rule so that you know what it is you're stepping away from.
Yeah, although I am going to push back on that slightly, just a language thing, and harken back to something Dan said much earlier in the season, which was that we want to talk about tools, not rules.
Yes.
And that's, I think, something that Nora shows is that she basically went into a hardware store and said, give me your tools, I'm going to make something.
Yeah, exactly. And, like a tool, there are ways you're supposed to use it and ways you're not. You can use it in ways you're not supposed to. There are risks to that, and you have to know what you're doing to get away with it.
Yeah, you do not want to cut off fingers.
Exactly.
At least not
not your own and not on accident.
And sometimes you just have to try it in order to learn that that's not, should you open the glass jar with a hammer? Maybe.
It'll
and you
work.
try it and then there were some downsides to that process. Didn't quite work the way I thought. Okay.
Yep.
Next time, same thing, but in a bowl. Okay, sure. Maybe you don't learn exactly the lessons.
Just know you need a broom nearby.
Exactly. But then through that, who knows? Maybe the broom, to kill this analogy to death, is turns out to be the thing that you end up using. And so I think there's a lot of times, I love what Howard said about the permission to try to play, and no one will know what you write in the dark. If you write something in 5th person, which is a new tense I just
What's 5th person?
It's like the 5th season.
Yeah,
you've got first person.
It's the perspective that has broken all of our other perspectives.
Look, if you can figure that out, go for it. And
just
if it
tap
goes,
into the cosmic mind of a being that doesn't experience time as a linear.
It's like second person subjunctivitis.
Well, hey, look, the only time to try this is when you're alone.
And with a net.
Yeah. And if you figure it out, come out and let us know, and we will have you on the podcast.
Listen,
I promise.
If you figure it out, publish it. We're gonna win a Nobel Prize.
I have created the 5th person.
Hey, let's take a break for a moment, because when we come back, I want to make a food metaphor.
So this week, I want to talk to you about one of my favorite movies I've seen this year and possibly ever. It's a movie called I Saw the TV Glow. It's out from A24 from the director Jane Schoenbrunn. It's her second movie. She's a queer trans director, and this movie is very much for the queers. It's like a really beautiful story. It's technically a horror movie because I think no one knows what else to call it, but there's very little in it that's like actively scary. At the same time, that is a profoundly unsettling experience for a very wide range of reasons. Basically, it's the story of two young people who are obsessed with a particular TV show. It's sort of set in the late 90s, and the TV show is very Buffy the Vampire Slayer-like. And so it's a movie that's a lot about our relationship to the media that we consume, our relationship to each other, and to our own sense of identity and how that changes over time, and what do we owe each other and what do we owe ourselves. It's an incredibly beautiful movie. It's so well done. It's really has such a specific, incredible visual palette. The soundtrack is absolutely killer. I cannot stop listening to it. It's full of bangers. So I can't recommend I Saw the TV Glow high enough. It just hit VOD and it'll probably be on streaming soon, so you should be able to watch it.
While I was reading this book, I was experimenting with some non-dairy, non-wheat sauces for Sandra and realized I needed words. I didn't even know what certain things were called. And so I went Googling and I found out that there were 5 French, they call them the mother sauces. Mm-hmm. And the more I drilled down into that, the more my inner taxonomist began to scream, because one of the sauces is a water in oil emulsion, and the other 4 are all begin with a roux, all begin with flour and butter thickening. And I was like, that's not 5 mother sauces, that's 2 mother sauces. It should have been a mother and a father sauce. And the point here is that when you are making something, the whole French cuisine thing, all of the, quote, daughter sauces, you start from an understanding of the sauce that you came from to make something new, and you don't step too far from it or nobody will know what they're eating.
Yeah.
And so I had that whole epiphany sitting over the pot making a sauce, realizing it has to still be food when I'm done. You know what else is a water and oil emulsion? Industrial lubricants. Mixtures of water and oil that are designed to provide coolant and lubricant. You can't eat those.
That is not where my brain went with industrial lubricant.
The point here, though, is that as we learn these tools, and as we file them for ourselves, we need to know why we're using them. We need to know how people in the past have used them. And Dongwon, as you categorized these, families of genre books, I feel like that's super important for us to remember.
Well, that's why I think it's important that it's not taxonomies, it's conversations, right?
Right.
Yeah. Genre is a conversation that we're all participating in. And, all the fights we see between different parts of the conversation, different subcategories, different subgenres, who's initiating it, who's leading it, who's determining it, all of those are because the conversation that we're in feels very natural and very important to us, right? So when you talk about the mother sauces, it's not so much that here are the 5, categories of sauce that everything needs to fit into. It's this is in conversation with the velouté. This is in conversation with the bechamel, and it's like those conversations. And once you say that, I see it on a menu and I'm like, okay, this descending in this kind of order, right? This is epic fantasy. This is adventure fantasy. This is romance. All those things create a conversation that I can then jump in and I know what language we're using. I know what terms we're agreeing on. And, the comp titles that you're talking about so often are the most rigid form of that, the most specific form of that, because we need it for like a business purpose. But I do think that they are useful still in certain ways of letting us understand who it is we're talking to and why we're having the conversation, right? I think military science fiction is having a different conversation than post-colonial fantasy is.
I was thinking about comp titles, and I think they're really important, obviously, for business. But I think it's also really cool to think about not just the what of a comp title, but also maybe some hows.
Yes.
So like there's like my book is like X plus Y, but also like I would love to have like the word styling of this and the plot of that and the character relationships of this third thing, because I think that helps us focus not on like if you're not in the middle of selling a book, like comparing yourself to the end product of somebody else, but trying to understand the process, joining the conversation versus sort of listening in and thinking like, well, why is nobody talking to me?
Yeah.
And part of it is figuring out how it works. I think that's so important and why I've loved doing this reading series, because it really got us into the how does it work?
Right.
And that's the thing that like, I think ultimately I will remember, even if I forget the individual books, which I won't because they're amazing. But like, even if I did somehow, like,
Yeah.
I think I still will remember like the tools and the craft that came with them.
Yeah, and I think that that thinking more consciously about the tradition that you're writing in, which is one of the things that we were looking at with the 5th season. It's like, oh yeah, if I think about that, if I think about who I want to be writing for, which I always think about kind of generally. I usually am also writing for one specific person, but if I am thinking more consciously about that and about the ways in which I want to invert something that somebody else has done, it gives me a broader palette to play with, and that's fun. I have really, really enjoyed the way we've been able to dig into this book, and I honestly wish we had more episodes that we could do with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a big, rich, dense text that there's so many things and so many conversations we could have here.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm looking forward to, and as of this moment, we haven't done it yet, is interviewing N.K. Jemisin and taking all of these thoughts that we've had across all of these episodes and trying to distill that into a conversation where we find out what really happened.
Yes,
Yeah, exactly.
Because almost certainly what we think the process was is not the process that went into creating this book.
Well, and one thing I want to reiterate for our listeners, we kind of hit this a couple times, but this, Howard, you were quoting from the acknowledgments of the book at one point about how incredibly difficult the process of writing this book was for N.K. Jemisin. We can look at this and say, this is a masterpiece. This is so exceptionally well done on X, Y, and Z. And as a reader, that can feel very intimidating, right? But what I want to remind you all is that this was hard work that she did over years and a lot of careful thought and
nearly threw away.
This book was, I think, a real struggle in a real way to get to where she wanted it to be. And that's because writing really good books is hard. Writing really exciting fiction, breaking new ground is all very difficult, especially when you're trying to find a 5th POV to write from. Finding that territory is difficult. And so if you're sitting there writing, being like, I don't know how to structure like this. I only know how to do, 5-act structure, 7-point plot structure, whatever it is. That's okay. We're not saying that you have to do anything like this. We're saying, look at this. There's so much we can learn from this, but also, God damn, this is hard.
Yeah.
There's a piece, an art piece called Inkwing. It's framed, hanging on the wall in our house, which was done by my daughter while she was at art school, or during the time when she was in art school. She was at home at the time, and which she had given up on, was furious at, to the point that she threw it, and it frisbeed and ended up on the roof of the house. And then she climbed up and pulled it down from the roof of the house. And the way we framed it, you can't quite see the bent corner. But I love that piece because it's gorgeous. I can't see flaws in it. I can't see anything wrong with it. And yet I know personally the artist who created it was so upset at it that she threw it onto the roof of my house.
This is a thing that a lot of people forget about. That there is that point in process. One of the other things that I want you to take away from this, when you're thinking about your structure and you're writing something, you're like, oh, this is a mess. For those of you who do crafting, has anyone walked into your crafting room while you were in process? You know what that looks like.
I do not want people looking at my wood shop halfway through.
It is an absolute mess. That is what early drafts are like. That is what the early structure is like. So you have freedom to be messy in those early drafts. The finished product that we have been all going, ooh, that's something that came after many iterations. So remember that while you're working on this, if you take nothing else away from this structure discussion, remember that you can work it in layers.
I think, and also that there is a way to take little bits of joy along the way.
Yeah.
I have been learning to play the guitar this year. I am quite bad, I will say still. But there are chords that I do now know how to make with my fingers without thinking about it that I didn't before. And one time I was strumming badly and I was like, but I actually know this is a G chord and I didn't before. And I was like, it is important to take a minute to marvel at the things you have mastered, the things you have learned, the things you feel good about, because there's always something more you could be doing. There's always somebody writing, quote unquote, a better book. There's always somebody else doing something you wish you could, but only you can do the things that you have done. And I think there's just something so important to take that with you and celebrate yourself because you rock.
Yeah, exactly.
And with that, I think we're going to give you some homework. We're actually going to give you homework with your own work in progress. I want you to reverse engineer an outline for your work in progress. This doesn't have to be incredibly detailed. This can just be like, here's the one important thing in this chapter, much like we had you do with at the beginning of this, where we had you look at the table of contents for this book. And then I want you to look at that outline that you've got, and I want you to try to add one parallel. This has been Writing Excuses. You're out of excuses. Now go write.
Have you ever wanted to ask one of the Writing Excuses hosts for very specific, very you-focused help? There's an offering on the Writing Excuses Patreon that will let you do exactly that. The private instruction tier includes everything from the lower tiers, plus a quarterly one-on-one Zoom meeting with a host of your choice. You might choose, for example, to work with me on your humorous prose, engage Dongwan's expertise on your world building, or study with Aaron to level up your game writing. Visit patreon.com/writing excuses for more details.
Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. For this episode, your hosts were Mary Robinette Kowal, Dongwan Song, Aaron Roberts, and Howard Taylor. This episode was engineered by Marshall Carr Jr., mastered by Alex Jackson, and produced by Emma Reynolds. For more information, visit writingexcuses.com.